Hey, everybody. We are continuing through the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Today, we take a pretty good step forward, I think, in the narrative part, the story part of this gospel, and we look at the calling of the first disciples. And I think, Michael, there's a sense in which the prologue stands out as different, but now we really get our first taste today of some of the ways in which John provides information unknown in the other Gospels. And so let me read this, read a few verses here, and then we'll come back and talk through them. The next day, John, this is the Baptist, again, was standing with two of his disciples. And as he watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here's the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. When Jesus turned and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We've found the Messiah," which is translated the Anointed One. He brought Simon to Jesus, who looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. So all of the Gospels are interested in that group that surrounds Jesus that we know as his disciples. Prominently, we know them as the 12 disciples, the inner core at least. And every gospel has some interest in the stories of how some, at least, of those men found their way to be following Jesus. We don't have a biography on all of them. We don't have origin story on all of them. What's interesting in John is that we get a story that other gospels don't tell us. John indicates that Andrew and one other disciple were disciples of John the Baptist. They were following John the Baptist. John the Baptist, as we've seen consistently already in this first chapter, praises Jesus, and these two disciples then become interested. And the strong implication, certainly for Andrew and for the other unnamed one as well, is that then they become followers. This isn't, I don't know, Michael, I don't know if we'd go so far as to say this is a different story, but it's a different detail that isn't highlighted by the other Gospels, in which I think Andrew and Simon are fishing, and he says, "Come and follow me," and they do. But there's no mention that either of them had previously followed John the Baptist. And so this, I think, is a good kind of putting our toe in the water with the Gospel of John and the way in which John will sometimes provide details that we really don't see in the other three Gospels.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a way of telling this story that gives precedence to the importance of John the Baptist. We've said that before in the previous study, and I encourage you to go back to the previous study. Certainly, if you want to learn more about the importance of John the Baptist in the book of John. But here, we're seeing how that importance is even lived out as now Jesus is making this selection of his disciples. His disciples are not just coming from anywhere. They're actually coming from John the Baptist's own inner circle. And that's fitting. It's right and it's good. These disciples have been hearing John talk about the coming Messiah. They've heard this gospel that this person was going to come. And then when John is there and when he exclaims, "Look, the Lamb of God," it's natural. It makes sense to us. It just follows that then these disciples of John, having been taught to look for the Messiah, are going to then be compelled to follow the Messiah once he arrives. And so it is, in a way, giving deference to the authority and the insight and the wisdom of John the Baptist, who is a prophet, right? On the other hand, it's also introducing us to the key characters of the story. Just very briefly, Clint, I want to make sure that we all sort of recognize what John, the gospel writer, is doing here, because we're only at verse 35 in John chapter 1. We're not far into this letter. And so it's important that we're not only introduced to the chief witness to who Jesus is, John the Baptist. It's not just important that we are introduced to the main character, who is, of course, Jesus himself, but it's also important that we are introduced to the key people who are going to not only be the core witnesses to who Jesus is, disciples, as we call them, but also the key people who will lead the church forward on the other side of Jesus' death. That is, Clint, important details in good storytelling, that you introduce the main characters who are going to have a through line, not just through this story, but through the story that will continue on beyond it. And I think this has been done masterfully. Here we have Jesus introduced with the relevant and requisite amount of authority and the clear distinction between Jesus, the Messiah, and John the Baptist, who's that forebearer. And you also have an introduction to some really key and important characters, not just in the story of Jesus, but in the story of the church that Jesus creates. And all of this has now happened in just a few short verses right in the beginning of this book.
And again, we sort of approach another interesting thing about the Gospel of John. I think all that's well said, Michael. We also have an introduction to a character who isn't introduced.
Yeah,
we have two disciples here of John, and we get told who one of them is, leaving us to ask, well, who is the other one? And a lot of scholars speculate that we are to sort of make of that is John the author, who will later probably call himself the beloved disciple, and who often narrates the story from a little bit of distance, almost a little bit of anonymity. And so it is likely that we encounter a firsthand account here, or something told as a firsthand account of John the author, who is very possibly this second follower of John the Baptist, who then becomes a follower of Jesus. And if we think about what Michael's just described, the movement here is searching for truth, seeing the one who is truth, and now moving a layer deeper in their own search for the Messiah. They have found him. And notice again that the first thing that Andrew does, right, with no hesitation, is that he goes and tells someone. In this case, his brother Simon. And he brings Simon to Jesus, who sees him and renames him. And this happens in other ways in the other gospel. Here it's very early, and it's not related to other stories. Here it's told as its own story. And he then tells him, you will be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. Both of those, Cephas is Aramaic, Petros or Peter is Greek, and they both have references to the word rock. So you are the rock. And if you remember other versions of this story in the other Gospels, Jesus says, you are the rock, and I'll build my church upon this rock. And it's after Peter makes his profession of the Christ. Here, it's just a detail. John assumes, well, people probably know who that is. He's Cephas, which is sometimes Peter. And John will, if I remember correctly, pretty consistently use the Aramaic version, though in English we're almost always just going to translate it Peter. But again, a slightly different version of a story that we see in other Gospels. Not different enough to be probably troubling, not different enough to raise questions about how do we reconcile. Just John has his own way and his own purpose and his own intention for telling the story. And he doesn't spend a lot of time on some of those details. He just gives us the high points.
This is a really tricky practice if you have been Christian for some period of time, because the idea of there being 4 Gospels at that point is probably not a novel idea for you. You've heard the Christmas story come from 2 Gospels, and you've heard the parables from 1 Gospel, right? So we're generally very comfortable as Christians sort of allowing these gospels to all speak to who Jesus is, and sometimes those things get blurred in our minds. But if you could for a moment just consider being in an older time where you don't have access to a whole book full of these letters, right? You receive the Gospel of John. That's all you have. Your church, your community in worship, you've got one codex, you got one book there, okay? And the telling of Jesus that you have, the authoritative telling of his life, death, resurrection, the meaning of the faith, is in John, okay? If that's the case, if these are the only words you've heard, I want you to hear the titles that Jesus is given within this first section of John. This selection alone, Jesus is called the Lamb of God, the Rabbi, the one foretold by Moses and the prophets, Rabbi, Son of God, King of Israel, and Son of Man. All of that goes up. Actually, some of that goes a little bit beyond. Sorry, that goes to verse 51. But just within this section that we're in here, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is given all of these names. And now if you go back to like your Christmas stories, right, where Jesus is the Prince of Peace or the Son of God, right? Here, John, when he wants to tell us who Jesus is, John wants us to know at the very front of the story. This is a emphasis of John that on day one, Jesus's first words, he deserves every title that could be given him. He is not going to be revealed in further level. That John has laid out this story such that the moment John the Baptist said, here's the Lamb of God, the disciples who had been following John are, at least some of them, compelled immediately by who Jesus is, and without thought or question, they're not only joining Jesus, but they are already evangelizing, to your point, Clint. And this is not, to your point, it's not a sort of rabbit trail. That this isn't a diversion from the other gospel stories. What it is a very strong and intentional Johannine emphasis upon the fact that Jesus Christ is fully God, fully human. It's a very developed theology of who Jesus is, and it is told in such a way that whoever had this book would know from the very start of it, not just the characters in it, but the character of the character who's at the center of it.
Yeah, and again, we see this beautiful theme in John. Once you encounter Jesus, you share that truth, you share that encounter. So far, each character who has come in contact with Jesus has then gone on to say something to someone else about who Jesus is. And we'll continue to see that. In fact, we'll see it right away tomorrow as Jesus continues to draw some of these men to himself, these early disciples, not all of whom are named in this first chapter, but the ones who are, we have their stories, and we have this idea that there is a compulsion when one encounters Christ to share him with others. And that's no accident. John loves that idea, and he's going to put it in front of us multiple times.
Clint, you may have more info on this than I have, but I'm not aware or have not read a very convincing or unanimous scholarly sort of opinion on why John, the gospel writer, seems to be coy with some of the characterization of where they enter into the story. Like you said, being the behind-the-scenes narrator. And that may have been a thing that was known to the earliest Christian community. Maybe there's some tradition connected to that. But if you're curious, why is that second disciple not just outright named? Unless you have read that, Clint, I'm not sure that I've heard a unanimous kind of voice on that.
I don't know if there's consensus, but I think the idea is late in this gospel, we will hear the author, definitely the author refer to himself as the beloved disciple. And,
right.
And I think the guiding assumption is that the community to whom he writes knows who he is. And so rather than name himself, he simply leaves allusions to his being there. And I think they know, or the assumption is at least, they know he's talking about himself. As to why he does it that way, I'm not sure there is a strong case that everyone agrees upon, but it is not something we'll see a lot, I think, in the middle of the gospel, but certainly here in the front and much more prominently at the end.
Well, I certainly hope that as we really dig now into not just the setup for Jesus, but his arrival, his ministry, his calling of disciples to himself, hopefully that this is a part of the study that you find compelling to yourself and your own sense of being called to Jesus, your own testimony to who he is, learning who he is, and how you can share that in the world. If you found this video and study helpful, give it a like. It will help others find it in their own future study. If you would like to join us as we continue on, there's a lot more to be fleshed out in this gospel, not just regarding Jesus, but all of the disciples that he calls. More to come in the study tomorrow. We would love to have you subscribe. Until we see you tomorrow, hope you're blessed.
Thanks, everybody.